No one in Dodge Creek had ever heard Sister Claire scream until the morning old Mr. Harper was found lifeless in his rocking chair. Folks claimed he was sitting just the way he always did, chin tilted up a little, eyes open like he was still waiting for someone to finish a sentence. Some swore he'd been gone since sunrise, but it was Claire who climbed onto his porch with a bottle of medicine and came running back down the street yelling that he was smiling at her. People made jokes about that scream for weeks. Said even the angels probably jumped, but none of them knew that the sound she made that day was nothing compared to the one she would let out later. And by the time you hear what caused it, you might feel your own chest tighten the way hers did. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. It started on a scorching afternoon near the Cimarron Trail. Claire drove the mission wagon alone, reins loose in her fingers, the sun beating straight through her veil like a blade. The land stretched empty in all directions. No riders, no cattle, nothing moving except heat rippling above the grass. She wouldn't have stopped if not for a sound she recognized instantly. A quick, sharp crack that didn't belong to summer. Not thunder, not a branch. She'd heard it only once before, outside the mission gate. A gunshot. She pulled the wagon to a halt and called out, expecting maybe a ranch hand, maybe a traveler. Nobody answered. She stepped down, the dirt burning through her shoes, and walked toward the tall grass. That's where she saw him, a man slumped against a bale of hay near an old log house, his shirt soaked dark on one side, his skin pale like the sun had drained every bit of color from him. When he lifted his head, his eyes met hers like he'd been waiting for her all day, like the whole afternoon had been holding its breath to bring the two of them to that exact moment. His voice was barely there. "Sister, I need your help." He tried to push himself upright, but his arm buckled. When she reached him, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. Not rough, not forceful, just desperate. The kind of grip a man used when he didn't have much strength left. He pulled her closer, his breaths coming out uneven, shaky, almost like a colt trying to stand after a long winter. "Sit," he whispered. "Please sit right here. Just trust me." She thought he was delirious until she saw the wound on his leg. A gunshot too close to the artery, blood pumping out in slow but steady pulses. She knew enough to understand what that meant. If she didn't put weight on it, he wouldn't live through the hour. So she sat where he told her to, right on top of the bale of hay, right over the spot where the wound hid beneath her skirt. The moment she settled, she felt the heat of his blood through her clothes and something solid beneath her, a worn leather pouch stuffed so tight it pushed upward. His eyes locked on hers, and for the first time she saw fear in a grown man look exactly like a prayer. What was inside that pouch, and who had been willing to kill him for it? Her heartbeat pounded so loud she could hear in her ears as she pressed her weight onto the wound. The man fought to steady his breathing. "Name's Jake. Jake Hollister," he whispered. "And I'm not supposed to still be alive." She asked who shot him. His answer came out like regret more than fear. People who don't want the truth getting out. His eyes rolled back for a moment, and she panicked, pushing harder. "Stay with me," she ordered. He forced a breath and nodded. Somehow, she didn't know how, she managed to drag him onto the mission wagon. Every bump made him groan. The sun dipped lower, turning the grass gold, and she talked to him just to keep him conscious. She found herself saying things she normally kept tucked away. How she missed her mother, how she hated Kansas dust, how she'd never sat on an injured man in her life, and hoped she never would again. He tried to smile. It came out crooked. When they reached his ranch, something in that empty yard tugged at her, like the place had been waiting on her too. Inside the barn, she laid him on a blanket. The wound was worse than she'd realized. A clean-through shot, deep and torn, meant to kill. She cleaned it with what little she had, tore part of her underskirt for bandages. He flinched at the cold water, then apologized for flinching, which made her laugh before she could stop herself. When she checked the leather pouch, he tensed like he expected a punch. She opened it just enough to see an old ledger filled with rushed, angry handwriting. A badge that didn't belong to him. A torn letter with a broken seal. And a small photograph of a young woman with her hand resting on Jake's arm. smiling like she had never doubted him for a moment. Claire didn't ask who she was. She didn't need to. His eyes told her enough. Jake was tangled in trouble far bigger than a wounded leg, and saving him meant she was already tangled in it too. Claire barely slept that night in the old barn. Every time the wind pushed against the boards, she jolted, convinced someone was coming to finish what had been started. She kept checking Jake's bandage, checking his breathing, checking the cracks in the door. He muttered sometimes in his sleep. Not quite prayers, not quite curses, more like a tired man arguing with heaven. Just before dawn, she slipped quietly into Dodge Creek for supplies. The streets were almost empty, the air still cool. A few saloon lamps glowed weakly, the way tired eyes refused to close after a long night. She kept her veil low, hoping to draw no attention. But halfway down Main Street, sharp voices broke the quiet. Someone yelling about rights. Someone else overturning a crate. When she hurried closer, she saw the Ramirez family, the kindest people in town, standing helpless in front of their ruined porch. Their windows were smashed, their tools scattered, and their young boy was being shoved against a tree by two men Claire didn't recognize. Without thinking, she rushed toward them. "Stop it. He's just a child." One of the men turned to her with the slow grin of someone who enjoyed breaking things. He said the family hadn't paid enough for grazing rights, that this was their reminder. Claire didn't back down. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe something in her had finally snapped. Her voice didn't shake when she told them to leave. The bigger man stepped closer, close enough for her to smell last night's whiskey on him. "Mind your own business, sister." Then he slapped the boy so hard the child dropped his knees. And something inside Claire, something she had spent years pushing down, rose like fire. She knelt beside the boy and held him tight, even as the men walked away laughing. Later she learned their names. Men working for Silas McGray, the same men who had hunted Jake. And suddenly the numbers she'd seen in Jake's leather pouch made terrible sense. The fear in every rancher's eyes. The quiet tension that always lingered in the saloons. It all led back to Silas, the man who had turned Dodge Creek into his own kingdom. When she returned to the barn, she told Jake everything. He listened without blinking. When she finished, he closed his eyes for a long moment and said what she already feared. Silas won't stop. Not until he owns every acre along the river. Not until anyone who stands in his way is gone. Claire sat beside him on the barn floor as the morning light slipped through the wood in thin lines. She realized she was already involved, already too deep. And strangely, she didn't feel the urge to step away. Not after seeing that boy's face. Not after hearing the crack of that gunshot in the field. Not after feeling Jake's blood under her hands. That evening, as they sat in the dirt beside one another, Jake finally asked, "What do we do now?" But it wasn't really a question. It was an invitation. What she said surprised even her. "We need to stop him." Jake nodded, as if he'd known she'd say that. "Then we need proof. More than that ledger." Silas keeps everything important locked in his office near the railroad camp. Letters, contracts, names. Claire rubbed her hands together, partly from nerves, partly because the night air slipped through the barn cracks like cold water. She had never broken into anything in her life, not even a cookie jar as a child. But the memory of that boy being struck stayed with her, burning under her ribs like a warning. She nodded. "I'll go." Jake tried to argue, but he barely made it to his feet before pain twisted across his face. She reached to steady him, but he pushed through it anyway, stubborn as a mule. "I'm coming," he said, and the look he gave her was enough to end the argument. They rode at dusk, heading toward the railroad sheds. The sky was a deep orange, the kind that usually made people pause and admire it. But for them, it felt like riding into something heavy and dangerous. The camp was quiet, a few dim lamps flickering. Two guards stood near some crates, arguing about money owed from card game. The noise was just enough to let Claire and Jake slip behind the tool shed unnoticed. Her heart beat so loudly she was sure the guards could hear it. The office door was cracked open. Jake squeezed through first, leaning on the frame. Claire followed, careful not to breathe too loud. The place smelled like tobacco and sweat. On the desk sat a thick ledger, the handwriting identical to the book in Jake's pouch. But this one was bigger, filled with names, sums, and notes written with a heavy, impatient hand. Enough to ruin Silas if it ever reached the right people. "Take it," Jake whispered. But before she could close it, heavy footsteps approached the shed. Someone was coming. Someone who might already know they were inside. The footsteps outside the shed grew heavier, slow, and unhurried, like the man walking didn't have a reason to rush because he believed the night already belonged to him. Claire froze, her fingertips still touching the corner of the ledger. She didn't dare breathe. Jake steadied himself on the edge of the desk, jaw tight, every muscle in his injured leg shaking from the effort of staying quiet. For a moment, Claire wondered if he could even stand if things went wrong. The boots stopped so close she felt the vibration through the floorboards. Whoever it was, he was right on the other side of the wall. Claire pressed her hand lightly against Jake's arm, more instinct than thought, as if her touch alone could hold him upright. He looked at her, and for a split second the fear in his eyes wasn't about Silas or being caught. It was the fear of watching someone else get hurt for him. Then the footsteps shifted. A small mercy. The man turned away, wandering back toward the campfire where the guard's laughter drifted through the darkness. Claire hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath until her lungs demanded air. Jake reached for her wrist with a shaky hand, maybe to steady himself, maybe to steady her, she wasn't sure. But his touch was warm, grounding in a way that surprised her. They slipped out the back door like two people who had no right surviving what they just escaped. Every step felt like walking across a thin wire strung over something deep and cold. Jake leaned heavily on her for the first few yards, and she didn't complain, not even when his weight made her knees wobble. She just held him tighter, thinking only about the next step, the next breath, the next chance not to be seen. When they reached the horses, Jake winced as he tried to mount. Claire caught his arm again, softer this time. "Tell me if it's too much." He gave a tired smile. "It's already too much. But I'm still here." The honesty in his voice stung her more than the danger around them. They rode through most of the night, the sky turning from black to a deep blue. The world felt bigger in those hours, quiet, stretched out, almost like it was watching them. Claire kept glancing at Jake, afraid he'd fall asleep and tumble from the saddle. He noticed and whispered, "Stop worrying," but he said it so gently that it sounded more like a thank you than a complaint. By the time they reached Dodge Creek, the horizon was glowing pale pink. Claire held the ledger tight against her chest, fingers numb from gripping it for so long. The federal marshal's office sat near the end of the street, shutters closed, a lantern still burning low inside. She felt her nerves buzz beneath her skin. Every instinct screamed that Silas would hear about this before noon. Jake slid off his horse and nearly buckled, catching himself on the post. She rushed to him, annoyed at him for being stubborn, annoyed at herself for caring so much. "You should be lying down, not limping into a courthouse," she whispered. He leaned closer, voice low and rough. "If I lie down now, I won't get back up. Not until this is done." Something in the way he said it, simple, plain like it was the last truth he owned, made her chest tighten. She didn't argue again. The marshal opened the door with sleepy eyes, but the moment he saw the ledger, everything sharpened. He brought them inside, shut the blinds, and listened. Claire spoke carefully, every detail, every threat, every name she had read in those pages. Jake added what he could between breaths. The marshal didn't interrupt once. When they finished, he let out a long exhale and said, This could bury him." Claire expected relief. Instead, she felt a knot in her stomach. Because if Silas realized what had been taken, he wouldn't sit quietly. He would come looking. Word traveled through Dodge Creek faster than anyone expected. People whispered in doorways. Men lingered near the courthouse. Mothers kept their children close. The air felt stretched thin, like the whole town was holding its breath with them. When the judge finally rode in weeks later, the streets overflowed with faces. Folks who had kept their heads down for too long. Folks who had lost land. Folks who had lost hope. Jake walked with a limp, but he didn't hide it. Claire walked beside him, her veil tucked away, hair braided back like she'd shed an old version of herself somewhere along the trail. Inside the courthouse, every seat was filled. Jake stood straight as the judge entered, but Claire noticed how tightly he gripped the bench with one hand. She didn't move away. She didn't pretend she wasn't afraid. Her hand brushed the back of his lightly, a small, quiet reminder that she was still there. When it was time, she stepped forward and spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The whole room leaned in. She read every name written in that ledger, every bribe, every threat. Silas shouted over her, called her a liar, called Jake a traitor. But his voice cracked, each word weaker than the last. Then the sheriff found the lockbox Claire had mentioned. The room shifted like a gust had passed through it. Heads lifted, people straightened, and one by one, ranchers began to stand and say what had happened to them. Silas McGray's reign cracked right in front of everyone. When the judge finally ordered the deputies to take Silas away, the room felt like it exhaled for the first time in years. But Claire didn't relax, not fully. Not even when Silas stumbled as they pulled him forward, shouting her name like a curse. "You think this is over?" he barked, struggling against the cuffs. "You think one little book ends me?" Claire didn't flinch. She met his glare, steady and unbroken. "It ends a part where you hurt people who can't fight back." Silas sneered. "And you think you're some kind of hero now? A sister playing sheriff?" She stepped closer, her heart pounding but her voice firm. "I'm just someone who finally stopped looking away." That shut him up, at least for a moment. The deputies hauled him out, his boots scraping the floor, his rage trailing behind him like smoke. Claire felt Jake beside her, breathing carefully, his hand gripping the bench to keep himself steady. When the doors closed and the noise faded, Jake let out a breath that trembled. "I didn't think we'd live long enough to see that." She gave him a look that was half relief, half disbelief. "I didn't think you'd live long enough for me to even get you into that wagon." A faint grin tugged at his mouth. "You trying to say I'm lucky?" "I'm trying to say you're stubborn," she replied. "Lucky is something else entirely." He chuckled and winced mid-laugh, grabbing his side. Claire reached for him without thinking, her hand on his arm. He didn't brush it off. He didn't pretend he didn't need it. He just let her hold him steady, which somehow felt heavier than any words. People filed out, murmuring, nodding to Claire and Jake with a kind of gratitude that made her chest tighten. She wasn't used to being looked at that way. She wasn't sure she ever wanted to be. Jake watched them quietly, his expression softening. "They're standing taller already," he said. "Funny how fast fear leaves when truth finally shows up." Claire studied him. "Are you all right?" He glanced down at his bandaged leg. "I've felt worse." Then he looked her in the eyes. "But I've never felt braver." That was when she felt it, the shift, the small, undeniable truth settling between them. Something had changed the moment she pressed her weight on his wound, and it had only grown with each step they survived together. Outside, the town gathered like they were witnessing something holy. Not just the end of a tyrant, but the start of a different life. Jake limped down the courthouse steps, Claire close enough that their arms brushed with each step. People parted for them, murmuring like they were part of the same breath. Mr. Ramirez stepped forward, hat in hand, his young son beside him. The boy's cheek carried a faint bruise, but his eyes were bright. The man cleared his throat. "Ma'am, sir, if you hadn't done this, if you hadn't stood up, my family, we'd still be living scared." Claire tried to shake her head. "You owe us nothing." But Mr. Ramirez shook his instead. "We owe you the truth. You gave us that back." He turned to Jake. "And you, Mr. Hollister, my land, my neighbors will remember what you risked." Jake swallowed hard. "Just remember why we did it. Because a place like this shouldn't belong to fear." The boy stepped forward slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. Claire's throat tightened. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You deserve to grow up in a place where men like Silas don't get to choose who suffers." Jake watched her, something warm flickering behind his tired eyes. When the crowd began to disperse, he leaned toward her with a hint of a smile. "You speak like you've been carrying that truth for a long time." She huffed softly. "I've been carrying a lot I never said out loud." Jake nodded, studying her face like he wanted to read every word she hadn't spoken yet. "Then maybe it's time to stop carrying things alone." That startled her more than any gunshot. He wasn't asking for help. He wasn't asking out of fear. He was offering something else, something bigger. Before she could answer, The judge approached with a stack of papers. "I've sent word to the territorial office," he said. "Silas's seizure of land won't hold up. Folks will get their acres back. Might take some time, but this ledger," he tapped the thick book in Claire's hands, "this changes everything." Claire nodded numbly. She felt Jake's gaze on her, steady and quiet. When the judge walked away, Jake said softly, "Claire, we did something good today." She didn't look at him at first. She looked at the courthouse doors, still open slightly, sunlight spilling through. "We did something right," she corrected. "Good and right aren't always the same." Jake let out a low breath. "You keep talking like that," he said, voice warm, "and a man might start believing there's a future worth fighting for." She finally turned to him. "And what about you? Do you believe that now?" He held her eyes without wavering. "I believe in you." Her heart jolted. Unexpected, sharp, real. And for the first time since the day she arrived in Kansas, Claire didn't feel lost. She felt found. That night in the barn felt different from the others. Quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves understood something had shifted. Claire helped Jake ease down onto the blanket, her hands careful but steady. He winced, breath catching, and she paused. "Tell me if it hurts too much," she said. Jake exhaled shakily. "Claire, everything hurts too much." She gave him a pointed look. "That's not helpful." He smirked faintly. "Didn't say I was trying to be." "Despite everything," she smiled. "Just a little." And that small curve of her lips seemed to pull something warm out of him. For a moment, they just looked at each other. No danger pressing in, no ledger weighing down their choices, no Silas lurking in the shadows. Just two people who had walked through fire together. Claire broke the silence first. "Jake, when you said earlier that I saved more than your life." She hesitated, fingers brushing the old wood beside her. "I don't know how to carry something like that." Jake's eyes softened. "Then don't carry it. Share it." She blinked. "With who?" He gave a slow, tired shrug. "With me. With whoever you trust. You don't have to be the strong one every second." She looked down, startled by how much the words shook her. "I'm not strong. Not really." Jake let out a low breath. "Claire, you held a bleeding stranger together with nothing but your hands and fear. You stood up to men twice your size. You walked into a courthouse knowing a whole town would hear your voice shake. If that's not strength, I don't know what is." Her throat tightened. "I'm not fearless." "I don't want fearless," Jake said gently. "I want honest." She met his gaze, and he didn't look away. He didn't pretend he was fine or unbroken. He let her see him completely. Worn, hurt, hopeful, afraid, but still trying. And something about that honesty made Claire sit down beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "You make it sound easy," she whispered. He shook his head. "It's not easy. It's worth it." They sat there in the quiet, the barn warm with the last bits of daylight. Claire listened to the soft rhythm of Jake's breathing, each breath steadier than the last. And she realized something she hadn't let herself admit until now. She didn't want to imagine a future where he wasn't beside her. Jake broke the silence this time. "What happens now, Claire? To you? To me? To all this?" His voice wasn't demanding. It wasn't desperate. It was careful, like he was afraid of touching something fragile. Claire stared at her hands. "I don't know. My life, the vows, the things I promised myself." She shook her head. "Everything feels different now." Jake's eyes flickered, cautious. "Different how?" She looked at him directly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I finally stepped into the right story." Jake stared at her, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and something deeper. "Claire, if you mean what I think you mean." She cut him off softly. "I mean that I don't want to go back to who I was." He went still, completely still. "You're talking about leaving the mission," he said quietly. She nodded. Jake swallowed, searching her face. "Don't choose because of me. If you walk away from that life, make sure it's because you want it, not because I showed up bleeding in a field." She moved closer, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. "I'm choosing because I want a life that's honest. A life where I don't hide behind rules I stopped believing in a long time ago." Jake's voice cracked slightly. "Claire, do you have any idea what you're saying to me right now?" Her eyes softened. "Do you want me to say it more clearly?" He swallowed. "Hard. Yes." She leaned in, her forehead almost touching his. "Jake Hollister, I'm not afraid of the life that waits for me. I'm only afraid of walking into it without you." His eyes closed for a moment, like the words were too much to hold all at once. Then he cupped her cheek gently, carefully, like he was touching something he didn't deserve. "You're going to ruin me," he whispered. She smiled softly. "Maybe we'll ruin each other." He laughed under his breath. "If that's the road, then I'll walk it with you." She placed her hand over his. "We'll walk it together." The barn stayed still around them, holding their promises like something sacred. Jake leaned forward slightly, his forehead resting against hers, their breath slow and warm in the quiet. "Claire," he whispered. He opened his eyes, searching hers. "No matter what happens, I want you to remember something." She tilted her head. "What?" Jake's voice dropped, steady and sure. "You were the bravest person I'd ever seen long before you ever looked my way." Claire felt the truth of it settle inside her like a heartbeat. "Jake." "Yes." She exhaled. "Don't let go." "I won't," he said. "Not ever." And in that barn, with night settling outside and silence wrapping around them like a blanket, two lives that had once been strangers quietly intertwined. The afternoon sun dipped lower as Claire and Jake walked away from the courthouse, the weight of what they'd done settling over them like dust after a storm. The town felt different, lighter, almost hopeful, but Claire felt something heavier inside her, something she wasn't ready to name. Jake walked slowly beside her, his limp more noticeable now that the adrenaline had faded. She stopped him before he could take another painful step. "Jake, you need to rest. You're pushing yourself too hard." He gave a tired half-smile. "Rest later. For now, let me pretend I'm still the man who could ride 50 miles without blinking." She crossed her arms. "You can pretend all you want, but your leg isn't pretending." He reached out, letting his fingers brush her wrist. "Claire, if I sit down now, I might not get back up." "Not today." His voice was soft, as if he was admitting something fragile. For a moment, they just stood there in the fading light, the street quiet around them. Claire felt her breath hitch, not from fear this time, but from the way he looked at her, like she'd become something steady in a world that had been tilted for too long. "Then lean on me," she said, her voice gentler than she meant it to be. "I'm not letting you fall." He didn't argue. He simply rested his hand on her arm, letting her take some of his weight. It wasn't weakness. It was trust, and she felt it like a pulse under her skin. They headed toward his ranch, moving slowly, the sky bleeding orange behind them. Halfway down the road, Jake broke the silence. "You know, when you showed up in that field, I thought I was seeing things." She shot him a sideways glance. "Delirium?" "Hope," he corrected, voice rough. "I hadn't felt that in a long time." Claire didn't know what to say, so she said the truth. "I didn't feel brave that day. I felt terrified." Jake gave a small laugh. "Then you did a damn good job pretending." She shook her head. "I wasn't pretending. I just couldn't walk away." Jake stopped walking, not because of pain, though it clearly hurt him, but because he wanted her to look at him. "You could have," he said softly. "Most people would have." She looked at his face, worn, unshaven, but honest in a way she wasn't used to. "I didn't want to," she whispered. His eyes softened. "Then maybe we're both here for a reason neither of us planned." Her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. She opened her mouth, but the words tangled, so she closed it again and kept walking. The ranch came into view, quiet, leaning, still carrying the scars of years left uncared for. Jake sighed when he saw it. "Not much to look at, is it?" Claire surprised herself. "It looks like a place that deserves a fresh start." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Are you talking about the ranch or the idiot who owns it?" She almost smiled. "Maybe both." He stared at her a long moment, his expression shifting. Hope, doubt, something deeper. Then he said quietly, "Claire, I don't know what comes next. For you, for me, for any of this. But I know one thing." She swallowed. "What's that?" Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the weariness and the warmth in his eyes. "You saved my life. Not just the bleeding part, the part that was giving up." Claire's breath caught. "Jake." He shook his head gently, as if telling her not to soften what he was trying to say. "I'm not expecting anything from you. I know the vows you made. I know the life you built before all this. And I'd never ask you to throw it away for some half-broken rancher who can't even climb on a horse without swearing. She didn't laugh. She didn't look away. She stepped forward instead. You didn't ask, she said quietly. I chose. Jake's chest rose sharply, like the air had punched him. For a moment, he just stared, trying to find the right words. Claire, I don't want to pull you into a life that's still healing. She took his hand, something she'd never dared until now. I'm still healing too. His fingers closed around hers. Not tight, just certain. Then maybe, he said slowly, we help each other. A long silence settled between them. Not awkward, not tense. Soft, warm, real. The kind that only happens when two people realize they're standing on the edge of something fragile and important. Claire looked up at him. Let's get you inside, before that leg gives out and you make me carry you. He laughed, and the sound loosened something in her chest. I'd pay good money to see you try. She squeezed his hand. Don't tempt me. He squeezed back. Wouldn't dream of it. And as they walked into the dim barn, the place where everything began, Claire realized she was no longer afraid of the path ahead. She was afraid of turning back. Morning came slow and soft, the kind that crept through broken barn boards and settled on everything like a reminder that life still moved forward, even after the hardest nights. Claire woke before Jake, her back aching from sleeping on the old floor, but her heart strangely calm. Jake lay on his side, breathing evenly for the first time since she'd met him. The tension that usually tightened his jaw was gone. His hand rested near hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth. She watched him for a moment, the way someone watches the proof that they made the right choice. When Jake finally stirred, he blinked up at her with a sleepy confusion. You're still here. She smiled softly. Where else would I go? His eyes softened, and for a second, he looked younger, almost boyish. I half thought I dreamed half of last night. You didn't, she said. I'm still here, and I'm not taking anything back. Jake pushed himself upright with a wince. Good, because I don't think I could pretend none of that happened. Claire hesitated before saying what had been circling her mind. Jake, when I talk to the bishop, when I tell him I'm stepping away, it won't be easy. Jake looked at her gently. Claire, if you tell him you're leaving, it'll be because you need a different life, not because of me. Don't carry me into that room like I'm part of your confession. She sighed. But you are part of it. He reached out, brushing a stray hair from her face. Then let me be the part you're not ashamed of. Her breath shook a little. I'm not ashamed of you. Then go tell him with your head up, he said quietly. Tell him the truth. She nodded, letting his words settle inside her. Hours later, they rode into Dodge Creek together. Jake insisted on going even though his leg still hurt. If you're walking into your future, he'd said, then I should at least be somewhere nearby. When they reached the small church office, Claire dismounted first. Jake stayed by the horses, watching her with a calm she didn't quite feel. She looked back at him, and he lifted his chin. You've survived worse, he said warmly. Go on. Inside, Bishop Allen sat at his desk, reading glasses low on his nose. He looked up with surprise when Claire entered. My child, he said softly. I wondered when you would come. Claire swallowed. I need to speak with you. He nodded, gesturing to the seat across from him. I've seen in your eyes for months. Something's shifting. Something calling you someplace new. Her breath caught. You knew. He smiled gently. You think I didn't notice the way you changed? You've carried questions you weren't born with. Pain you didn't choose. And a courage you didn't know you had. His eyes softened even more. Tell me what you need. Claire exhaled slowly. I want to leave the order. The words hung in the air, steady, final, true. The bishop didn't look shocked. He simply nodded once, deeply. Tell me why. She wiped her palms on her skirt. Because I can't stand in a life that asks me to look away from suffering when everything in me wants to run toward it. Because I want to choose the path that feels honest. And because... Her voice faltered. The bishop leaned forward kindly. Because your heart found a home somewhere else? She blinked at him, startled. How did you know? My dear, he said with a soft smile, faith doesn't vanish when love arrives. Sometimes it grows. Tears stung her eyes, not from sadness but from the relief of not being judged. He signed the first page of her dispensation request with steady hands. "You have lived your vows bravely," he said. "But vows that cage the soul are not holy. Go in peace." Claire stood slowly, breath trembling. "Thank you." Outside, Jake straightened when he saw her. He searched her face silently, waiting, afraid to ask. She walked toward him, each step feeling lighter than the last. "It's done," she said. Jake's jaw tightened with emotion. "You okay?" She nodded. "Better than okay." Then Jake did something he'd never done before. He picked up her hand in front of the whole quiet street, without hesitation, without shame. "What happens now?" he asked softly. Claire looked down at their linked hands. "We start over," she whispered. "Together." Jake closed his eyes for a moment, as if the breath he took held years of hope he never let himself feel. "Then let's go home," he said. They rode back to the ranch side by side, a quiet promise settling between them like the first warm day after winter. But neither of them knew that life still had one test left, one more choice that would define the rest of their days. The weeks that followed were slow and gentle, the kind of days Claire had forgotten existed. The ranch, once quiet and worn down, began to feel like a place with heartbeat again. Jake pushed himself harder than he should have, fixing fences, repairing the barn roof, putting life back in a land that had been forgotten. Claire helped in every way she could, sometimes with bandages, sometimes with stubborn arguments, sometimes just by standing next to him when he needed strength he didn't admit out loud. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Claire found Jake sitting on the fence, staring toward the river. His hat was low, his hands resting loosely on his knees. When she approached, he didn't look up immediately. "You thinking about Silas again?" she asked gently. Jake shook his head. "No, not anymore." "What then?" He let out a slow breath. "Just life. How fast it changes. How close I came to losing mine before you showed up." She sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "You didn't lose it." "No," he said softly. "I found something better." He finally turned toward her, eyes warmer than the fading sunlight. "Claire, you sure this life is what you want? This place, this land, this man who limps more than he walks?" She smiled, brushing her fingers lightly over his hand. "Jake, I chose you long before you realized I had." He swallowed, emotions rising in his throat. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," she whispered. "Not easy, but simple." He laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "You're something else. And you're impossible," she said, nudging his shoulder. They fell into a quiet that felt soft instead of heavy. Two people settling into a life they never planned but somehow still fit. A soft breeze rustled the grass around them. Fireflies blinked to life. The Cimarron moved slow and steady. It sounded like an old lullaby. Jake cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about something." "Oh," she teased. "That always worries me." He didn't smile this time. His voice grew serious, steady. "I want to marry you." Claire froze, not from fear, but from how right the words felt in her bones. Jake looked straight ahead. "Not because you saved my life. Not because you left the order. Not because we went through hell together. But because when I look at you, Claire, I see the rest of my days." Her heart thudded, full and warm. "Jake." He turned toward her now, eyes unguarded. "I'm not asking you for perfection. I'm not promising I won't make mistakes. I'm promising one thing only. Whatever life we build, I'll stand by you. Every step." Claire's breath trembled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't need perfect. I just need something real." Jake reached out, brushing the tear with his thumb. "Then say yes." She didn't look away. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. Jake let out a breath that sounded like his heart finally finding a home. Their wedding was small, a few friends, a handful of neighbors, the Ramirez family, standing proudly near the front. Claire wore a simple blue dress. Jake stood straighter than he had in months, his limp still there, but less heavy, less defining. When she walked toward him, his eyes shone with something she'd never seen before: peace. As they stood before the river, hands intertwined, Jake whispered, "You changed my whole world." Claire smiled. "You helped me find mine." And when they spoke their vows, they didn't sound like promises made out of duty. They sounded like two people choosing each other despite everything life had thrown at them. After the ceremony, they walked down to the riverbank, the breeze soft, the sky glowing gold. Jake asked quietly, "Do you think we earned all this?" Claire slipped her hand into his. "We didn't earn it. We grew into it." He nodded slowly. "Feels like a miracle." "No," she said. "Just courage." He met her eyes. "Yours or mine?" She shook her head gently. "Both." They stood there in the quiet, the world stretching out in front of them. Messy, unpredictable, beautiful. And for the first time in years, neither of them felt afraid. Moral lesson. Sometimes life tests you by pulling you into storms you never asked for. But the moment you choose to stand up, not just for yourself, but for someone else, the world begins to shift. Courage doesn't come from being fearless. It comes from being honest, from refusing to turn away, from believing that light can grow in the darkest places. And when you follow that courage, even one small step at a time, you often find the life you were meant to live waiting right on the other side.